My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 29 years old and 2 days before my wedding, my parents handed me an ultimatum in a church dressing room. Take my grandfather off the head or they would walk out of my rehearsal and out of my wedding. He's a retired janitor, my dad said, straightening his cuffs like the sentence needed ironing. He embarrasses us. That janitor packed my school lunches for 11 years. My family thought the worst thing that could happen at my reception was 200 guests seeing a man with calloused hands sitting beside the bride. They were wrong. What happened when my father's CEO set down his glass, buttoned his jacket, and walked across that ballroom floor? I promise you, my parents never saw it coming. And even I didn't know the half of it. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet people finally get their say. Every week we share stories about standing your ground with the people who share your name. If you believe the ones who raised you deserve the seat of honor, you're in the right place. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe because this story does not end where you think it does. I was 7 years old the summer my parents moved to Columbus. Dad had landed a job at Meridian Freight Systems, a trucking company with 12,000 employees and a glass tower he talked about like a cathedral. Mom went with him to sell houses to other people on their way up. I stayed in Dayton with Grandpa Walter because it was just for a year, sweetheart, until we're settled. 1 year became elementary school, then middle school, then my whole childhood. Grandpa's house smelled like floor wax and black coffee, and dinner hit the table at 6 sharp whether the world cooperated or not. He was the custodian at Garfield Elementary, the same school I attended. And every night when he locked those big front doors, he said the same words like a prayer with a mop handle in it. Leave every room better than you found it. He said it when I spilled paint in the art room and stayed to scrub it. He said it when I broke Mrs. Petty's window and spent a summer earning the glass. He said it so often I stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. My parents drove down from Columbus every couple of months, and I'll be fair, they never missed a birthday. But their visits felt less like family and more like inspections. Dad reviewed my report cards the way he reviewed quarterly freight numbers, looking for the dip. And every time they left, my mother would pause on the porch and glance back at Grandpa's little house. The clean gutters, the straight fence, the flag by the door, the way she looked at a listing, she couldn't move. I didn't have a word for that look when I was 9. I have one now. Here's what you need to know about my parents. My father, Richard Brooks, is 54, Vice President of Regional Operations at Meridian, and he irons his weekend shirts. My mother, Linda, is 52, a top-producing realtor in Columbus with a billboard on Route 23 and a laugh she saves for clients. They aren't cruel people. They're worse than cruel in a way that's harder to explain. They keep score. Love in my parents' house was a scoreboard. Grades were points. Colleges were points. Job titles were the playoffs. When I was 22, I called to tell them I'd passed the postal exam and gotten a route in Dayton. Benefits, a pension, a union, and work I could be proud of on a street where people knew my name. Dad went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And you're happy telling people that?" He didn't yell. He never yells. He just filed me somewhere lower on the board and moved on. Mom mailed me a blazer for interviews someday. I wore it once to a funeral. But the strangest thing, the thing I noticed for years without understanding it was how my father treated Grandpa Walter. He didn't argue with him, he erased him. Company picnics, holiday parties. The year Dad made vice president and rented out half a steakhouse. Grandpa was never invited, not once. And Grandpa never said a word about it. I asked Dad about it exactly one time at Thanksgiving, the year I turned 25. His face closed like a garage door coming down. Some worlds shouldn't mix, Hannah. That was the whole answer. It would be 4 more years before I understood what he was so afraid of. And by then, the invitations had my name on them. Ethan Cole proposed to me on my mail route, which tells you everything about him. He teaches 11th grade history. He laughs at his own jokes half a second too early. And one Tuesday in April, he was waiting at the last mailbox on Cedar Crest Drive, holding a little velvet box like it was a registered letter I had to sign for. I said yes before he finished the question. We wanted a simple wedding. Marigold Hall in Dayton, 200 guests if both families sprawled, my grandfather at the head table, and a honeymoon we could pay for in cash. Then came the engagement dinner in Columbus. Mom set the table with the good china that no one is actually allowed to enjoy. And after the salads, Dad slid an envelope across the tablecloth like a man closing a deal. Inside was a check for $30,000. So it's done properly, he said. Mom touched my wrist. Think of it as staging, honey. Weddings are listings. Presentation is everything. I want to be honest with you because it matters later. I hesitated. I'd been managing my parents my whole life, translating them for other people, smoothing their edges, and some tired part of me thought, take the check. Keep the peace. You know how to handle them. So, I said, thank you. I said it would be a gift, not a vote. Dad smiled and agreed a little too quickly. And then, while Mom refilled the wine, he slid a second thing across the table. A leather folder monogrammed, the kind he carries into board reviews. Just a few thoughts, he said, on the guest list. I opened it expecting names of cousins. What I found instead was an org chart with place. My father's guest list had 26 names on it, and I'd never shared a meal with any of them. Regional directors, 2 senior vice presidents, the head of logistics for the entire Midwest corridor, and at the top, underlined twice, Raymond Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Freight Systems. My wedding had become a business function between the appetizers and the cake. It took me a week of phone calls to understand why. Meridian's senior VP of operations had retired in March. The chair was still empty, and my father had spent 20 years positioning himself exactly one rung below it. A wedding was the one event where he could put a CEO, a country band, and his own last name in the same room and call it family. I did what I always did. I managed it. I gave up the band I wanted because Mom said fiddles read as county fair. I gave up my florist because Mom had a girl. I told myself each surrender was small and that peace was worth more than centerpieces and that I was keeping the important things. Ethan watched me negotiate away my own wedding one voicemail at a time and finally said gently, "You keep calling it their event." I laughed it off. Then the seating chart arrived. Mom emailed it on a Sunday night, color-coded, professionally rendered with Meridian executives fanned around the dance floor like a security detail. I found Ethan's parents at a side table. I found my college roommate by the restrooms. And then I found my grandfather, the man who taught me to ride a bike in a school parking lot at table 14 back corner next to the kitchen door behind a pillar where the photographs wouldn't reach. I called my mother before I'd finished scrolling. I kept my voice level because level is the only voice that works on Linda Brooks. Grandpa raised me. He sits at the head table. Mom sighed the sigh she uses on buyers who want granite on a laminate budget. Sweetheart, the head is for the wedding party and the hosts and we are hosting. It's cleaner this way. Cleaner. I wrote the word down on the back of an envelope so I'd stop hearing it. When I drove over to Grandpa's that evening, he was oiling the hinges on his screen door because in Walter Brooks's world, a squeak is a moral failing. I told him about table 14. I was ready to be angry for both of us. He just wiped his hands on the rag that lives in his back pocket and said, "I've sat in worse seats, kiddo. Don't burn down your family over a chair." That's the thing about my grandfather, 78 years old, and I had never once heard him fight for his own dignity. I used to think he didn't know how. It never occurred to me that a man might be so certain of something that he doesn't need other people to vote on it. Before I left, I noticed his good suit hanging on the closet door, fresh from the cleaners, with the brown shoes he polishes himself lined up underneath. Once a year every year since I was a kid, Grandpa puts on that suit and goes to what he calls his pension meeting downtown. He was gone all afternoon that Thursday. He came home with a ballpoint pen in his shirt pocket, silver, engraved with a little compass rose. I remember thinking it looked expensive for a pension office. I didn't ask. If you want to understand my father, you have to go back to a cafeteria in 1984. And she's Dad's older sister. And over coffee that week, while she was trying to talk me into flexibility on the seating, she let the story slip. Richard was 12. Grandpa was the maintenance man at the old Harlan trucking depot back then, and everybody at school knew it because a town that size knows everything. One lunch period, a table of boys whose fathers wore ties decided to have some fun. They soaked a rag from the janitor's cart in the water fountain and dropped it on my father's lunch tray right on his food. And one of them leaned in close and said, "Your dad missed a spot." The whole table laughed. Carol says Richard didn't say a word. He walked home, threw his tray story at Grandpa like an accusation, and begged him to get a different job. Any job, one with a desk. And Grandpa, who had a mortgage and 2 kids and a wife starting to get sick, said the only thing he knew how to say, "Work is work." Carol swears Dad never forgave that sentence. He mowed lawns until he could buy clothes nobody could laugh at. He was the first Brooks to finish college. He has spent 40 years making sure no one could ever drop a rag on his tray again. I sat in that coffee shop and I acted for a 12-year-old boy I'd never met. Then I remembered that the boy was 54 now and the man he kept throwing rags at was his own father. That Sunday, Mom texted me, "Family meeting at our house. We need to discuss presentation." The family meeting had a slide deck. I wish I were exaggerating. I drove the 70 miles to Columbus and sat at my parents' kitchen island while my father clicked through a presentation titled Brooks Cole Wedding Run of Show. Meridian's little compass rose logo ghosted in the corner of every slide like a watermark. There was a timeline. There was a photo protocol which mostly meant which backdrops Mom had approved. And then second to last slide in that clean corporate font seating optics. Dad set down the clicker and talked to me the way he talks to underperforming terminals. Raymond Whitfield would be seated 14 feet from the head table. He said every director in the region would have a sightline to my chair and 4 feet from the bride. He said we will have a retired school janitor in a J.C. Penney suit. That's the story the company tells on Monday. That's the only story. I said, Grandpa sits at the head table. And my voice didn't shake, which I was proud of because my hands were another matter. Dad looked at me the way he looks at a number that won't reconcile. Then he said the sentence he'd clearly rehearsed in the car, the mirror, the shower, his whole life. People remember the mop, Hannah, not the man. My mother studied her countertop quartz, by the way. She'd have mentioned it. I picked up my keys and told them the seating chart was done being discussed and Dad called after me, calm as a forecast. Then you'd better hope nobody asks him what he did for a living. I sat in my car in their driveway for 10 minutes before I trusted my hands on the wheel. If you've ever had to explain to your own family why the person who raised you deserves a seat at your table, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one of them on my lunch break parked in my mail truck, and subscribe if you're staying with me because what my parents did at that rehearsal still puts a tremor in my voice. And what a stranger in a better suit did 2 days after that changed every single thing my family believed about itself. My mother doesn't argue, she campaigns. Within a week, my phone was a switchboard. Aunt Carol called first and the warmth from our coffee date had been replaced with talking points. Your father has worked 20 years for this opening. Hannah, 20 years. It's one dinner. One evening of your grandfather sitting somewhere comfortable. Don't cost your dad his shot at that chair. I asked her if she remembered telling me the cafeteria story. She said that was different. And then she couldn't explain how. And then she had a casserole in the oven. My cousin Beth texted a paragraph about keeping the peace for the older generation, which was rich since the older generation in question was the one being hidden behind a pillar. Even our pastor got a friendly call from Linda Brooks about streamlining the family elements of the service. He told me about it with a raised eyebrow and let it die there. God bless him. By Friday, I understood the shape of it. My parents weren't lobbying for a seating chart. They were recruiting witnesses so that when I gave in, it would look like consensus instead of surrender. And here's the part that scared me. It was working on me. I know how that sounds. But when every phone call for a week tells you that you're the unreasonable one, you start doing math on your own heart. Then Ethan came home from parent-teacher conferences and mentioned too casually that his mother had gotten a call from mine. Something about the rehearsal dinner menu and a gentle suggestion about the right volume for the groom's side of the family. Ethan's parents are retired school teachers. My mother had rated them like a property. That was the night I stopped doing math. That Sunday, Ethan's parents had us all to dinner, including Grandpa, whom they'd invited with an actual mailed card because Nancy Cole believes in stamps. I watched my grandfather walk into a house he'd never been in and get treated like a visiting dignitary. Ethan's dad wanted his opinion on a sagging gutter. His mom wanted the story about the winter of '78 again. At some point, the screen door started catching and Grandpa had it fixed in 10 minutes with a screwdriver from his truck. And nobody was embarrassed and nobody apologized for him. And I sat there with my dinner roll, realizing I had never once seen my grandfather relaxed at my parents' table. Not in 22 years. On the drive home, Ethan asked the question he'd been carrying all night. The father-daughter dance. What are you going to do? I stared at the road. Because here is the truth I hadn't said out loud. I was still planning to dance with my father. Tradition is tradition, I told Ethan. You only get one, Dad. He let it sit for a while, then said, sure. And who taught you to dance? I didn't answer. The answer was a kitchen in Dayton, a transistor radio, a 60-year-old man counting 1, 2, 3 while an 11-year-old stood on his shoe tops after her parents can't another visit. I turned up the radio and Ethan, who knows when a fact needs time to finish its work, let me have the silence. The next morning, Mom called about the dress fitting. She'd scheduled the family photo list with the photographer, she said. She read me the names. It took me until the end of the list to notice the one that wasn't on it. The missing photo name was the tremor before the earthquake because that same week, I discovered what the $30,000 had actually purchased. I called our caterer about swapping the fish course and got a puzzled pause. Oh, we'll need Mrs. Brooks to approve that. She's the signer now. The signer. While I'd been fending off phone calls, my mother had quietly upgraded the catering package and resigned the contract in her own name. Same with the photographer, whose new invoice listed a second shooter dedicated to the corporate guests, which is a phrase I hope never to type again. It wasn't theft. It was neater than theft. Whoever signs decides. My mother has said it about real estate my whole life, and I just never imagined I'd be the property. I sat at my kitchen table that night with every wedding document I had, and Ethan graded essays across from me, and I sorted paper like I sort mail, which is to say ruthlessly. Florist, there's, caterer, there's, photographer, there's, and then at the bottom of the pile, the venue, Marigold Hall, booked 11 months ago, deposit paid from my checking account. One signature on the line, and the signature was mine. I put my finger on it and left it there for a while. My parents had bought the flowers, the food, and the pictures. They had not bought the room. Ethan looked up, saw my face, and put down his red pen. You've got that route look, he said. What route look? The one where the dog is loose and you deliver the street. Anyway, I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks. In the morning, I drove to Grandpa's to tell him my plan, and instead, he made me an offer that broke my heart a little. Grandpa poured my coffee, sat me down at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 11 years, and slid a folded piece of paper across the wood. It was a savings account statement. I have a little puppy, he said. Take it. No strings. Strings are your parents' hobby, not mine. I looked at the number, which was modest and careful and exactly what you'd expect from a man who darns his own socks. And I couldn't do anything for a second because my throat had quit. A man who worked 45 years was offering to empty the drawer for a party. I told him no. I told him his job was to wear his good suit, sit where I put him, and save me a dance if his knee allowed. He grumbled that his knee was fine, which it isn't. On my way out, I stopped where I always stop at the crooked line of pictures in the hallway. Grandma Ruth in her Easter hat, my mail truck photo from the Dayton paper, and one I'd walked past 1,000 times without really looking. A young man who was unmistakably my grandfather, wary and grinning, standing beside a truck cab with Harlan Trucking painted on the door. He wasn't holding a mop in the picture. He was holding a roll of paper, big sheets curled like blueprints, and there was a pencil behind his ear. "Grandpa, what's this from?" He came and stood beside me with his coffee and looked at it for longer than the question needed. "I kept their floors," he said at last, "and a few other things." Then he asked if I wanted pie in the voice that means the subject is closed. I let it close. 3 weeks later, I would remember the pencil. On a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks before the wedding, I took a vacation day and drove Grandpa to Garfield Elementary because he still volunteers there one morning a month, fixing what the district won't pay to fix. I hadn't been inside since 6th grade. The halls had shrunk the way childhood halls do, and I got to watch something I'd been too young to see the first time, the way that building treats Walter Brooks. The office ladies lit up. The retired cook, Miss Dorothy, who comes in Tuesdays to run the food pantry, hugged him and called him Mr. Brooks in the tone people save for surgeons. A janitor 30 years his junior trailed him like a resident on rounds. And over the door of the old custodian's room, laminated and sun-faded, a strip of paper in my grandfather's block printing, "Leave every room better than you found it." He'd taped it there for the kids, Dorothy told me. Teachers still point to it. While Grandpa rewired a water fountain, Dorothy fed me coffee, cake, and gossip. And then she said the thing that snagged. "You know the day he dresses up every year. Town car comes for him. Long black thing. Driver in a suit. First time I saw it. I said, 'Walter, who died?' And he laughed and said, 'Nobody, Dorothy. Some old paperwork just refuses to. A town car for a pension meeting.'" I chewed my coffee cake and filed it in the drawer where you put things that don't fit anywhere. Then I looked at the sign over the door again and made the decision I'd been circling for a week. It was time to give something back better than I'd found it. The next morning, I drove to Columbus with an envelope of my own. My parents' kitchen island is white quartz, $4,000. And I know that because Mom tells people. I set the envelope on it. Inside was their check for $30,000 intact, undeposited, 3 months old, and one typed page. What I was canceling. The upgraded catering package, the corporate photo, the florist with the fern wall, what I was keeping, Marigold Hall, whose contract had my name on it, and every promise I'd already made to people I loved. Dad read the page like a resignation letter. Mom read the check like a death certificate. "You can't afford this wedding," she said, and she wasn't wrong. And I told her the new wedding would be one I could afford, which was the point of weddings back when they worked. Nobody yelled. My family doesn't yell. We just adjust our forecasts. I drove the 70M home with the radio off and my spine straight. And that night, I sat at my own kitchen table with a calligraphy pen I'd bought for $11, and I did the small thing that, looking back, was the whole war. I hand-lettered the place cards, all of them, and I saved his for last. Brown ink, my best letters, and set it upright on the window sill over the sink where I would see it every morning for the next 2 weeks. Walter Brooks, head table. It's a strange thing to arm yourself with card stock, but every morning while the coffee brewed, that little tent of paper stood there like a fence post, and I'd read it once and go deliver the mail. Thursday, Dad's voicemail arrived. 11 seconds flat as a shipping manifest. "You're embarrassing us in front of the most important people in my life." I replayed it 3 times. He never noticed what he'd just ranked. Here's what a wedding looks like when you hand back $30,000. The live band became a retired music teacher named Gloria, and the hall's old upright piano tuned on a Saturday by a man who owed Grandpa a favor from 1998. The fern wall became garden roses from 3 backyards on my mail route. Because when your customers hear your wedding lost its florist, ladies you've delivered to for 7 years start volunteering their gardens like it's the war effort. Miss Dorothy commandeered the catering gap for the cocktail hour, and the food pantry ladies baked like a denomination depended on it. Was I sad about any of it? I keep checking that pocket and finding it empty. My mother was sad enough for both of us. "Without us, it's a potluck, not a wedding," she said on the phone, and then in the silky voice she uses for closing. You know, your father and I have been asking ourselves whether we can even attend something like this. There it was. The last card in their deck played casually like an afterthought. Attendance itself, I said. I hope you'll be there, and meant it and hated that I meant it. And we hung up on a silence with teeth. 2 days later, an RSVP card landed in my own mailbox, which still makes me smile. A mail carrier getting mail. Heavy cream talk. Confident fountain pen. Mr. Raymond Whitfield accepts with pleasure. The CEO of Meridian Freight Systems was coming to my potluck. I stood at my mailbox laughing and then not quite laughing because my father had invited the one guest he could not afford to be absent in front of. Whatever my parents decided about attending, that cream card had just decided it for them. Dad called on a Sunday night with his negotiating voice on. The one that's all warm leather and no floor. He'd been thinking, he said. He wanted to offer a path forward, he said. Option A: Grandpa attends the ceremony. The church part is fine. Churches are humble. And then quietly skips the reception. He hates crowds anyway. He'd be relieved. Option B: Grandpa comes to the reception and sits at table 14, reframed now as a kindness near the exit Hannah for his comfort. The man is 78. I sat on my porch steps listening to my father redesign his own shame as chivalry, and I gave him credit. It was a better draft than the last one. When he finished, I said, he doesn't dislike crowds, Dad. He dislikes being hidden. Those are different things. A pause, then quieter with the leather worn off. You don't understand what one dinner can cost a man. He was closer to honest in that sentence than he'd been all year. And part of me wanted to meet him there. Ask him about the boy with the tray. Tell him I knew. Overmanaging my family is my oldest habit, and habits reach for you hardest right before you quit them. But I looked through the kitchen window at a piece of cardstock standing on my windowsill, and I held my line right there on the porch, glad he couldn't see my free hand shaking. The seat is his, Dad. My father exhaled through his nose, the sound he makes when a vendor won't move. Then we'll see who shows up, he said, and was gone. The rehearsal stood 4 days out. The pastor confirmed the next morning. My parents had called the church. They would be attending after all to finalize arrangements. 2 nights before the rehearsal, I found Grandpa on his porch with the radio low, gluing the sole of a shoe that a reasonable man would have buried years ago. He didn't look up when he said it. Don't lose your family over a chair, kiddo. I can love you from any table in that room. I sat down on the step below him, the spot where I'd shelled beans and cried over boys and memorized state capitals. And for once, in my careful, managed, level-voiced life, I said the true thing with no packaging on it. You are my family. You're the one who stayed. The glue brush stopped. My grandfather looked out at the yard like something in the hedge needed supervising, and he took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt tail for a long time. That's how men his age cry, if you're wondering. Then he put them back on and said, the weather was turning. And I said, it sure was. And we sat there in the kind of silence you can live in. When I got up to leave, I watched through the window as he went inside to the old roll-top desk in the den, the one drawer he keeps locked, the key on the ring with all his brass school keys. He opened it and stood there looking down at something. A fat envelope is all I could see. Manila, soft at the corners like it had been handled for decades. He didn't take it out. He touched it once. The way you touch a headstone, then locked the drawer and turned off the lamp. I drove home telling myself it was pension papers, deeds, old mamp. 2 nights later, my parents walked into the rehearsal 40 minutes early. I'm the kind of person who walks a new route before she carries a full bag on it. So the day before the rehearsal, I went to both buildings alone. At the church, I taped the processional order inside the vestry door where nervous groomsmen would actually see it. At Marigold Hall, I stood in the empty ballroom with the manager, walked the floor plan one final time, and then did the thing I'd been saving. From my bag, I took the place cards, hand-lettered, rubber-banded by table, and set the head myself. Ethan, me, his parents, his sister, and centered beside the bride's seat, brown ink, my best letters, Walter Brooks, head table. I stood the little tent of cardstock next to a water glass, and it looked so small for a thing I'd bled over, and I said the words to the empty room out loud like a crazy person, because he wasn't there to say them for me. Leave every room better than you found it. Then I drove home past the church purely from habit, the way you check a mailbox flag. And that's when my stomach dropped through the floorboards at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. My parents' silver Lexus was parked in the church lot. Rehearsal was Friday. Nobody had a reason to be there, but there was Mom's shape in the passenger seat, and the trunk was open, and my father stood behind the car in his shirt sleeves, reading something off a printed page to the pastor on the front steps. My father does not arrive early. In 54 years, the man has never once been early out of enthusiasm. He arrives early to negotiate. Before we walk into that rehearsal together, let me ask you something. If your grandparents ever showed up for you when your own parents didn't, would you give this video a like for them? Mine packed my lunches for 11 years and never once missed a school pickup. And make sure you're subscribed, because what a CEO did at my reception in front of 200 guests is the part of this story I still have to tell twice before anyone believes me. The rehearsal itself went beautifully, which should have warned me. Thursday evening, golden light through the stained glass, the pastor walking us through the processional twice. Grandpa stood at the back of the aisle in his cardigan, holding my elbow at the exact pressure of a man who has carried things his whole life and knows which ones are breakable. We laughed. Ethan's sister cried during a practice run, which everyone agreed was a good sign. And then while the wedding party milled around the vestry eating Miss Dorothy's lemon bars, my father said, "Hannah, a word, family only." The dressing room off the vestry is small, all dark wood and choir robes, and my parents arranged themselves in it like a closing team. Mom held a fresh print out of her seating chart, color-coded, as if the last month had been a clerical misunderstanding. Dad didn't raise his voice because the wedding party was one thin door away, and that thin door was the point. He kept it low and reasonable, which is how he says his worst things. We're asking one final time. Move Walter off the head table. Ray Whitfield will be 14 feet away. Directors, spouses, cameras. He's a retired janitor, Hannah. He embarrasses us. And my mother, reached into the trash can moment of my whole life. She picked up the head place cards she'd found on the venue walkthrough that afternoon. She'd gone to Merrill Hall. She'd pulled his card and she held up the little tent of brown ink, Walter Brooks, my $11 calligraphy, and she crumpled it. Not angrily. That's the thing I can't forget. She crumpled it the way you crumple junk mail. Absently, while saying, "We'll have it redone in the calligrapher's hand. It'll look intentional." The paper made almost no sound. And in the doorway behind them, holding 3 lemon bars on a napkin he'd brought for us to share, stood my grandfather. He'd heard all of it. I watched his spine straighten one vertebrae at a time, like a flag going up. Nobody spoke. Grandpa set the napkin of lemon bars down on the vestment table, gentle as a man diffusing something, and said, "I'll wait in the truck, kiddo." And it was the kiddo that did it. The steadiness of it, no wobble at all. A man reassuring his granddaughter while his son stood 10 feet away, calling him an embarrassment through a door. Something in me went very quiet and very organized, the way it does at 4:30 in the morning when the mail is late and there's nothing to do but sort. I stepped past my father, picked the crumpled place card out of the trash, and smoothed it flat against my knee, crease by crease, taking my time, letting the room watch. Then I turned around. The seat is his. It's not on the table, Dad. He is the table. He's the only reason there's a family at this wedding at all. My father started to say something about perspective. I wasn't finished. If you walk out of this church tonight, that's yours to do, but then you come Saturday as guests. Regular guests, no run of show, no photo protocol, no seating optics. You tried to buy a better version of this family for $30,000. And when I handed the check back, you started spending relatives instead. The version you want isn't for sale. The dressing room door had drifted open. The wedding party stood frozen in the vestry with lemon bars halfway to their mouths. And I let them stand there because my parents taught me that witnesses change behavior. And for once, the lesson was working for me. Mom recovered first. You're being dramatic. We'll revisit tomorrow. But Dad buttoned his suit jacket. One button. The tell of a man ending a meeting that has stopped going his way. Then enjoy your potluck, he said. They walked past the pastor, past the wedding party, past their own reflection in the sanctuary glass, and the big oak door swung shut behind them with a boom like a judge's gavel. Into the silence, our pastor cleared his throat, kind and awkward as a country vet. So, who will be walking the bride? I want to be honest about what winning felt like that night. It felt like losing. There's no trophy for holding a line against your own parents. There's just a parking lot and your fiancé's hand on your back in a mail truck you sit in at 9 at night because it's the only place that's ever been 100% yours. Ethan didn't try to fix it. He just sat in the passenger seat where the parcels go, folded up like a giraffe, and held my hand while I shook. Then we drove to Grandpa's because there was nowhere else the night could end. He left the porch light on. He always leaves the porch light on. He took one look at my face, went inside, and came back out with two things. A slice of pie I didn't ask for, and a small square of pressed cotton, white, edged in blue, forget-me-nots. Grandma Ruth's handkerchief. Something borrowed, he said. She'd want it back eventually, so that's the borrowed part handled. I laughed and it came out wet. And then my grandfather looked out at the dark yard and said the strangest thing in the same voice he uses for weather. I wasn't always just the janitor, kiddo. But being the janitor was never the part to be ashamed of. Your dad got that exactly backwards. I asked him what he meant. The first part, the wasn't always part. He patted my hand, told me a bride needs her sleep, and stood up with both hands on his knees the way he does. Conversation over. At the door, I turned around. Walk me down the aisle Saturday. He went still, then. You sure you want these old keys jingling down an aisle? That's a yes. In Walter, I was home and nearly asleep when my phone lit the ceiling. Mom, 11:04 p.m. We will attend on Saturday. For appearances. We owe your father's company that much. We owe your father's company that much. I read it 4 times, and by the 4th, I was almost grateful because it was the most honest sentence my mother had produced all year. They came back for the audience, the same audience they'd left for. The Saturday of my wedding was one of those blue October days Ohio hands out as an apology for February, and my parents were there. Third pew, right side, dressed impeccably, wearing the smiles they wear in the photos on Mom's real estate flyers. Their decision to come, I later learned, had firmed up about 11 minutes after word of Raymond Whitfield's RSVP reached the regional office group chat. Whatever they came, some part of me that will never fully grow up was still glad to see the backs of their heads from the vestibule. And then I stopped looking at them because my grandfather was standing next to me in his one good suit, the annual meeting suit. Navy, older than Ethan, pressed to razor creases, brown shoes glowing with his own elbow grease. His brass key ring stayed home. He'd tucked the key's little leather fob in his breast pocket anyway, worn smooth as a riverstone. For luck, he said 40 years of locking up behind everybody. Figured tonight I'd walk somebody in for a change. Don't you dare, I told my eyes, and my eyes did anyway. The ceremony was short and true. Gloria played the old upright's cousin, the church organ, like she was 25 again. Ethan's vows had a footnote in them, an actual footnote, because he's a history teacher, and lost to it. Mine were one paragraph, and the man who taught me every word of them sat 6 feet away in the front row in the seat where the father of the bride sits. And nobody had dared to redo that card. At 5 o'clock, as golden hour hit Marigold Hall, our venue manager touched my elbow. Mrs. Cole, Mr. Whitfield's car just pulled in. Here's what my parents' version of my reception looked like because they ran their program inside my potluck like an embassy operating on foreign soil. Dad intercepted Raymond Whitfield at the coat check and began what I can only call a network safari, steering the CEO from director to director with a hand hovering at his shoulder blade, his wine glass a prop he never drank from. Mom had scouted a corner with good light and no pillar, and she gently herded photo-worthy people into it all evening like a border collie in silk. And 14 feet away sat the version of the evening I had paid for myself. The head table on its low riser, Ethan's parents, his sister, my college roommate promoted from the restroom table in one stroke of a pen. And at my right hand at the seat of honor, with a smoothed-out crease-scarred place card standing at attention in front of his water glass, Walter Brooks, brown ink, slightly wrinkled, entirely legible. My grandfather holding court without saying 50 words, while Miss Dorothy and the pantry ladies kept his plate full like a pit crew. Every so often I caught my father glancing at that card, the wrinkles in it, and looking away. The evening was warm. The roses from my mail route were ridiculous and perfect, and Gloria owned that upright piano. I had almost stopped watching the room like a carrier watching a loose dog when I noticed something odd at the far end of the ballroom. Raymond Whitfield had stopped listening to my father. Mid-sentence, Midnose eyes had gone right past Dad's shoulder and locked onto the head table, and his eyebrows were doing something slow and complicated. He squinted the way a man squints at an address he's delivered to before in another life on another street. And then he set down his glass. "Excuse me one moment," Raymond Whitfield said to no one in particular, which in this case was my father. Mid an anecdote and he started across the ballroom. "You have to understand the physics of a room like that. 200 guests 40 minutes into dinner, everybody watching everybody, and the most important man in the building suddenly walking a straight line with intent. Conversation died table by table and awake behind him like dominoes going down on felt. My mother's border collie radar swung around. My father stood stranded near the coat check with his anecdote half told and his hand still shaped for a shoulder that had left. Whitfield passed the cake table, past the wedding party, past me with a small polite nod I couldn't read. And I remember my whole body going cold with one thought. He's going to say something about the janitor. Dad got to him. "This is happening at my wedding." He stopped in front of my grandfather and Grandpa. "I will see this until I die." Grandpa set down his fork, wiped his mouth with his napkin, unhurried, and looked up with the mild level face of a man who has been waiting for a bus he knew would come eventually. The whole ballroom had gone so quiet, I could hear the ice shift in someone's glass, that little glassy avalanche. Miss Dorothy froze with the coffee pot in the air. Gloria lifted her hands off the piano keys and left them hovering. Raymond Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Freight Systems, 12,000 employees, buttoned his jacket and drew himself up straight, the way men his age do when they're about to say something they consider historic. If your heart is pounding right now, mine was louder, and I was standing in the middle of it in a white dress with no idea what was coming. Comment head table right now if you already believe my grandfather had earned that seat whatever happened next, and stay with me because what that CEO said in front of 200 guests and my whole family is the reason this story exists, and my father's face will never look the same to me again. Raymond Whitfield held out both hands, the two-handed clasp they teach you somewhere above the level my father has ever reached. And his voice carried to the corners of that ballroom without a microphone anywhere near it. "Welcome back, Founder Brooks." That was all. That was everything. I watched the sentence travel across my wedding reception like weather. The Meridian tables heard it first and went from polite quiet to the specific electric silence of employees doing arithmetic. Founder Brooks. The bride is a Brooks. The vice president over there is a Brooks. And the old man at the head table in the pressed navy suit with the crease-scarred place card in front of his water glass. The CEO had just called him founder with the capital letter audible. I found my father's face in the crowd, and I will tell you exactly what happened to it because the title of this story in my memory is his face. It went white, not pale. White wax, white coat check ticket white. The color of a man watching 30 years of arithmetic come apart in public. His wine glass tipped in his hand and a director caught his elbow. My mother, one table over, had stopped moving entirely, her whole face still smiling from the last photograph while her eyes tried to leave the building. And my grandfather. My grandfather shook Raymond Whitfield's hand the way he shakes everyone's hand once firmly like a latch closing and said, "Raymond, you're interrupting the salad course." The CEO of 12,000 employees laughed like a schoolboy, asked if he might join the table, and sat down across from Miss Dorothy, who poured him coffee with the serenity of a woman who has fed too many important men to be impressed by one more. The rest of the room stayed on its feet inside its own skin, and my father started walking toward the head. What the room got next was not a speech. Raymond Whitfield stood with his coffee cup, asked the bride's permission with a little bow that made the pantry ladies coo, and gave my wedding 60 seconds of company history that exists in no brochure. In 1988, he said Harlan Trucking was 90 days from going under and a depot maintenance man nobody had ever asked stayed late one night and redrew the entire regional routing system on the back of packing paper. Hub and spoke load consolidation, the bones of everything the company still runs today. Dale Harland, God rest him, had the sense to listen. The maintenance man became a silent partner. And in 1996, when the company reorganized as Meridian Freight Systems, that partner sold his operating stake back, kept his 40% through a holding company, took the title of Chairman Emeritus, and asked for exactly one thing in return. That his name stay out of it. Dale wanted a self-made founder story for the customers, Whitfield said, and Walter wanted to go home by 6. Both men got their wish, and with Dale 7 years gone now, Whitfield figured that old promise had finally been kept long enough. I sit with him once a year, Whitfield said, lifting his coffee toward my grandfather. And once a year he tells me the same thing, that every route this company runs was drawn by a man everyone in the building walked past for years without seeing. I used to think he was being modest. A pause you could park a truck in. He was being precise. The pen with the compass rose. The same compass rose that watermarked my father's slides. The town car Dorothy saw the pension meeting once a year in the good navy suit. The pencil behind his ear in that hallway photograph. And the roll of paper in his hands. The fat manila envelope in a locked roll-top drawer. Every odd sock in my memory drawer paired itself in about 4 seconds, and I had to hold Ethan's arm across the room. I watched my mother do the same math and arrived somewhere very different. She was already moving her chair. By the time Whitfield sat down, my parents were closing in on the head table, wearing brand new faces. You have never seen a renovation completed as fast as the one my parents performed on themselves in the next 10 minutes. My mother materialized at Grandpa's elbow with a dessert plate, laughing at something he hadn't said. Her chair somehow now adjacent to his, telling Miss Dorothy they simply had to get Dad's pie recipe. Dad, a word I had not heard her use for Walter Brooks in my living memory. My father shook Whitfield's hand and said something about family running deep in the company, and his voice held. It really did. That's the training. But his face was still finding its color, and his eyes kept skidding off his own father like a truck on black ice. Grandpa received all of it the way he receives weather. Then Dad touched my arm. Hallway, 1 minute. Please. This should have warned me. Out in the corridor by the coat check, my father, 54 years old, vice president of regional operations, looked at me with a face I'd wanted my whole childhood. Warm, open, urgent, 100% focused on me and said, "You have to fix this. Tonight before Ray leaves, talk to your grandfather. Tell him about the senior VP chair. He listens to you. You're the only one he's ever listened to." I stood there in my wedding dress hearing it. And then he put the roof on it. And after that, sweetheart, all of this, the rehearsal, the seating, everything, we put it behind us. Clean slate. We're a family again. There it was. Everything I'd wanted since I was 7 years old. Offered with a warm hand on my shoulder in a hallway at a price. 22 years I'd waited for my father to call me sweetheart in that voice. It took a stranger's greeting to teach it to him in one night. I looked through the doorway at the head table where my grandfather was back on his salad like a man with no history at all. And I felt the oldest muscle in my body flex. The fixer, the translator, the girl who smooths it over, because here at last was the deal I'd been born being trained for. One conversation and I could have my whole family wrapped and delivered. All I had to do was become the go-between again. All I had to do was spend the seat of honor my grandfather never asked for on the chair my father had never earned. I heard myself exhale. "No," I said. My father blinked. Hannah, you wanted a better table, Dad. He built the room. I said it quietly the way he taught me without meaning to. And then I walked back into my reception and left him standing in the hallway with his clean slate. What happened next took about 90 seconds and cost me the last version of my childhood I'd been saving. I went to the DJ booth, moved one item up the schedule, and took the microphone. My voice went out over 200 guests, steady as a route I'd walked 1,000 times. Ladies and gentlemen, the father-daughter dance. Heads turned toward my father in the hallway doorway. I watched people find him, mark him, wait for him to move, and I walked the other way, past my mother's frozen smile, past the meridian tables, to the head, where I stopped in front of a 78-year-old man in a navy suit and put out my hand, palm up, the way he taught me to offer sugar to a horse. You've walked me everywhere else, I said. Walk me through this one, too, Grandpa. The room made a sound I can't spell. He looked up at me for a long second, glanced once at his son by the doorway, and then Walter Brooks pushed himself up with both hands flat on the table, took my hand, and led me onto the floor his whole life had earned. Gloria didn't play the song on the schedule. She looked at Grandpa, got some tiny signal I'll never decode, and started, "What a Wonderful World," on that old upright, slow and plain, the way it sounds in a kitchen. My grandfather dances like a man who learned in a living room with a woman he loved. Small steps, sure frame, counting under his breath out of 50-year-old habit. 1, 2, 3 and I was 11 again and standing on his shoe tops. Except now I was crying onto a navy lapel that smelled like cedar and barbasol. Around us the room stood, and I let them blur. I understood something during that song that I'd been circling my whole life, and I'll give it to you the way it arrived. Plain. I had spent 22 years believing that belonging to my family was a job with performance reviews, and that if I just managed everything well enough, translated hard enough, smoothed enough edges, I would finally earn my chair. And the entire time, the only person who never once made me apply for his love was the man whose hands were rough from keys and bleach and other people's floors. Belonging isn't wages. It's a gift or it's nothing. Somewhere past the second verse, I whispered the only thing there was to say, straight into the cedar and barbasol. Leave every room better than you found it. My grandfather's arm tightened half an inch. Old men don't sob, they compress. You just did, kiddo, he said. When the song ended, he did not make a speech. He held my hand up like a square dance collar, turned to the room, and raised his water glass with the other hand. To my granddaughter, said the quietest man I have ever loved, in a voice that reached the coat check, who never once asked what a person was worth before loving them. 200 glasses went up. Miss Dorothy's coffee pot went up, and by the time the applause washed out and the lights came back to normal, the 2 seats my parents had taken at table 6 were empty. They had gone. No goodbye. We cut the cake without them. Here's the accounting. 3 months on because I know you want it and because I sort mail for a living and I like a clean ledger. The Monday after the wedding, my grandfather asked me to lunch at the diner on Wayne Avenue and offered over meatloaf to set up a trust for me, for Ethan, for the house we rent. I told him no. And I want you to understand it wasn't pride or anger or a gesture. It's that I finally understood what he'd been doing for 30 years, sitting on 40% of an empire in a 2-bedroom house with a squeakless screen door. The money was never the point of him, and I wasn't about to make it the point of us. I kept the 2 things I'd already accepted, the dance and Sunday breakfast. And I told him the rest of my life I could deliver myself. He grumbled that I was stubborn, rich, coming from him. He did do one thing with the money that year, the only public thing he's ever done with it. That spring, the school district announced the Ruth Brooks Scholarship full ride every year for graduating kids of the district's custodians, cooks, bus drivers, and groundskeepers. He made them promise not to put his face on anything. The plaque at Garfield Elementary that's been taped over a door there for 20 years. As for my father, nobody fired him. That's not how any of this works. And honestly, it's better this way. Richard Brooks still parks in the same spot at Meridian Freight Systems and works 1 rung below a chair he'll probably never sit in now. Nobody punished him. The story simply got around. The rehearsal, the walkout, the reception. And it turns out optics were the one thing he was right about all along. He sent me an email in November. 2 lines, no subject. I didn't know. That's not an excuse. I've read it more times than I'll admit. I haven't answered it yet. And here's the thing my therapist and my grandfather agree on, which is a first. I don't owe it an answer on anyone's schedule but mine. The door isn't locked. It's just not my job to hold it open anymore. And it never was. My mother mailed us a crystal picture frame for Christmas. Heavy Austrian. The card signed Mom and Dad in her flawless open house cursive. I did use it. The photo I chose is the one Ethan's cousin took from the edge of the dance floor. An old man in a navy suit mid-turn laughing and a bride on his arm looking up at him like the whole room was his. Because it was. It always had been. We still do Sunday breakfast. 7:30 his kitchen. My turn to bring the eggs. 2 weeks ago, I caught him at the sink afterward, washing my coffee mug before I'd even finished my coffee. Force of habit, and I told him the room was fine as I found it. He laughed until he had to sit down. On the windowsill above his sink, flattened under a jelly jar full of pens, there's a small rectangle of cardstock with a crease scar down the middle. Brown ink, my best letters. He kept it. My grandfather owned 40% of an empire for 30 years. And never once used it to buy a person. And my father chased a title for 30 years and nearly sold one. So if you take anything from my wedding, take this. The seat of honor was never about what either man had because dignity isn't the name on your office door. It's what you leave behind in every room you're trusted to clean. That was Hannah's story. A crumpled place card, a CEO on his feet, one father-daughter dance that told the truth out loud. If someone in your family ever mistook a title for a person's worth, tell me that story in the comments. I read everyone. And tell me this, who's earned the head table at your wedding? Subscribe to Calm Drama Stories for more quiet people who finally get their say. See you in the next one.